Can guilt drive you mad, or is madness the reason for guilt in the first place? I'm Dre, and this is The Midnight Hour. Tonight we will be going back to the Master of Darkness, Edgar Allan Poe, and one of his most famous tales, The Telltale Heart. The Telltale Heart is written in a very obsessive manner in terms of the narrator explaining his situation and his journey through a night filled with horror and terror, and here's pretty much how the story goes. The narrator lives in a house with an old man. It could be his relative, but we're never really told, so we're not sure. Now, this old man has a pale blue eye, and it disturbs the narrator so much that the narrator decides, okay, I'm going to off him in his sleep. He creaks into the old man's bedroom and turns on the lantern ever so gently so that a sliver of light passes upon his eye. However, it's always closed until the very last night. On the last night, he notices the light hitting the pale blue eye, and it disturbs him so much that with a shriek, he jumps forward, he leaps forward and pulls the old man off the bed, pulls the bed over him, and the deed is done. However, there comes a knock at the door. He goes down to answer it, and it turns out to be 3 policemen. One of his neighbors, has heard a loud shriek and suspects something of foul play. So he, being so arrogant and so sure of himself, invites the 3 police officers inside, gets them all seats, gets them all chairs, and starts to chit-chat with them. Has a couple laughs, and he himself sits on the very spot of the floorboard that he has placed the old man's lifeless body underneath, because that's the extent of his arrogance. That's how far it goes. Now, of course, in true Poe fashion, something starts to upset the narrator, and he becomes so obsessive and paranoid about the beating heart of the old man that he starts to hear it. He starts to hear it, and he starts to freak out that the policemen can hear it, and that the policemen are now toying with him, and he gets so riled up that he gets off his seat. He starts to pace back and forth. He starts to yell and swear, and all the while the policemen are still sitting there chatting it up, laughing it up. Finally, the narrator loses all patience and pulls up the floorboards to expose not only the beating heart of the old man, but the old man himself, his body, his lifeless body. And that's how the story ends. Now, there is a lot going on in this story in a very short amount of writing. However, I've chosen 3 highlighted sections that we're going to look over that I think really capture it. The first of which is the very first paragraph that really gets into the nature of the narrator's mindset, and it goes, "True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease has sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story." Okay, so that shows you plainly that the narrator has lost touch with reality in terms of him being able to hear all things in heaven and earth and a lot of things in hell. And how can you possibly say that he's mad, though? He is so acute in his hearing and his senses. But of course, we as the reader know that something is incredibly off, and something bad is going to happen if this narrator is let loose to his own devices, and that's exactly what happens. Now, for the night preceding the dreadful deed, the narrator sneaks into the old man's room. One night, the old man wakes up because he thinks he hears something, and he says, "What's that? Who's there?" And he stays awake in his bed for nearly an hour, just observing, listening to all the sounds in the room. And the narrator, actually, Poe, captures this moment very, very beautifully in a way. And it says, "Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, 'It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp.' Yes, he has been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room." Creepy. Creepy, and it gives us a reason to shudder and just realize, okay, this narrator really is about his business. He's really serious in wanting this old man gone. And so we can't help but see through his eyes at this point. And it's scary. It scares the reader. Quite frankly, we aren't sure how far he's willing to go. And to be completely honest, once we read the full story and we see the extent of his madness, it's a little too much, even for Poe. However, we get to the third highlighted section. And this is the part that really climaxes into complete and utter paranoia of the narrator once he starts to hear the beating heart of the old man, who has already passed, by the way. So these are the last few phrases of the story, and it goes, "No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here, it is the beating of his hideous heart. Again, a little creepy and incredibly filled with such pure anxiety that the reader feels what the narrator feels, okay? We are invited into his world, and it's a very paranoid and a very mad world, okay? And once we reach the end of the story, we're almost glad and can take a deep breath of relief that it is over. His madness and our journey through it has come to an end. And although it's an amazing story and well written, of course, the climax is just so full of this oppressive feeling that we can't help but just be so glad when it's over. So to answer the introduction's question, can guilt drive a person mad? Absolutely. I think it definitely can. But in this case, the narrator's madness is what makes him guilty, and then that guilt drives him even madder. So it's like this vicious cycle, the chicken or the egg. We're not sure which started, and I would say that the initial feeling was madness in this case. Unless he did horrible things in the past, which only made him madder from the guilt that he felt then. But in this specific case, I think it was madness. And that drove him to this act. And of course, he felt guilty from it. So it just fueled that madness until he could take it no longer. Next week, we're going to lighten things up once more, but not in an emotional way. It's still going to be emotionally heavy. Think of it as like a precursor to The Great Gatsby, which is one of my all-time dearest and nearest stories to my heart. We're going to be looking at when one person builds an entire life off of an illusion, off of a fantasy. Like if you felt something, comment if you wrote something, and I will see you next Sunday at the Midnight Hour.